reminding folks, we are grateful, so grateful that you all are here with us today and reminding you, we understand that, with capitalism, your time is divided out, right? There's always something that needs to be taking place so that you can possibly spend money doing something else. So we thank you so much for your choice to be here. And we do hope that you will consider donating, because our comrades in Burkina Faso and in other parts are doing everything they can to help combat what the colonizer has worked really hard to communicate, is basically unlearning truth and unlearning who we are. So your donations help us to recenter that and to resurface why it's so important for us to know who we are and know where we come from. And beyond that, to understand just how rich the continent is that we can call home. Being able to understand that is really key. So it's not just that this money is not really important, but you're allowing other folks to have access from a very early stage, for them to have some type of education that they may not have otherwise had access to, especially because there's so many other entities that are influencing our African youth in terms of teaching them very colonial and imperialist concepts early on. And so our job is to try to combat that and really help them unlearn that so that they can actually learn something of substance that matters. So with that, we are excited to talk to you today about how some of our ancestors worked really hard to resist the imperialist ways that were taking over. And so, we should start by thinking about King Leopold and what the impact of this choice, what the choices were that this guy did. And so just thinking more about that and understanding that the power that this European had was so ravishing in terms of the incredible mass murders that he was able to commit under his power and under his leadership, being able to influence other people to kill, when I say thousands of Africans, that's what I'm talking about. And for what? Because resources from the continent were more important to be stolen. And when we tried to stop him and fought back, 10 million Congolese folks were murdered because of that. And at what cost? At the cost of the Congolese uranium, right? And so just thinking about how much of an impact that had, first of all, understanding that we did fight back, because again, that's not really communicated a lot in the literature. And so we want to be very clear about that right now, but also understanding that, when we hear folks give praise to King Leopold, and when we hear folks give praise to Queen Elizabeth and the first or the second or whoever, whatever stage the person is at, I think it's really important for us to just kind of break down who these folks are. Like, just really think about that. And really, at this point, you should understand that if capitalism is honoring someone, that probably means that they raped a lot of people or killed a lot of people or made it really hard for people to live in a world because they were poor. And the opposite of that is also true, that if capitalism is working really hard to terminate someone, working really hard to eradicate them and to erase them from time and space and history and herstory and their history, then that probably means they were doing something worth fighting for. And we need to speak their name as much as possible, whether they are alive or whether they have become an ancestor for us. And so, yeah, just next time you hear somebody say, oh, well, we have a lot to thank King Leopold for, just think about how he was able to steal Congolese uranium, and at the cost of that, he killed 10 million Congolese Africans. Just really think about that. Just understand that this is what we're dealing with. And this is not new. We've always understood that people would stop at nothing to kill Africans because of the resources. And it's ironic that Africa is so rich with all these resources, but yet they talk all this trash about how it's not a developed place and how it's not, a place that you would want to visit, and you shouldn't take your family there, and you shouldn't want to go there. You shouldn't even have a passport if you're African, because you should not use it to go home. But that, in actuality, that's all by design. That's all the rhetoric that they're trying to spit and push through our throats. Because really, if we're not interested in going, then we have no interest in protecting the resources. And that means we're not in their way for them to get the resources. So, just thinking more about how we were influenced into believing that we must accept how it looks and what it means to fit into this capitalist society. We must accept that. It was never an idea for us to think about how we could fight back like our Congolese comrades. It was never an idea for us to think about how we didn't have to fit into capitalism. It's not an idea today. It's not a common theme for us to talk about. This is just what we do. You go to school, you get educated, you get a job, you get a car, you get a car note, you get a house. Like, these are the things, right? You should always be keeping up with the Joneses. You should be keeping as many resources as possible. And if you're not making enough money, you should make more. And then, to add insult to injury, then we add in systems of oppression. So, even though you're not making as much, if you're not identified as the male, that shouldn't stop you, but you can't make too much, because if you make more than your partner who might be a male, well, now you're emasculating him and all these things. And so it just gets really, really convoluted, where we're losing the value of looking at people anymore. But capitalism doesn't care about that. And it also doesn't want you to see that that is a problem. Capitalism does not want you to see that it's a problem for you to lose your humanity. And that's what we failed to understand. We failed to understand that this same empire, this capitalist empire or this imperialist empire, they have only viewed us as pawns on a chessboard to fall out because of their desire, to fall out from their desire of how much of an influence they have had on us, and teaching us what it means to be selfish and self-centered, and teaching us what it means to be self-presenting, and to only think about how what we have done has allowed us to be in the spaces that we're in, teaching us what it means to have a class divide. That was all based on the system, reminding us that if we make more money than somebody else, then we must have done something right and they must have done something wrong, right? Like, these are all things in place with that. And so in doing that, and these empires working so hard to make sure that we are feeling like our current status is based on their desire, then meanwhile, those are the same efforts that they're still pushing so that they can rob us. And I mean ideologically rob us, I mean socially, I mean physically, right? So ideologically, continuing to tell lie after lie, and not at once questioning whether or not some of that is based on truth. And if you know anything about lying, then you know the best way to cover up a lie is to do what? To continue lying, right? Because at some point the person might is the key word, start to think a little bit more critically, and they might start to say, well, that's what you said last time. And you said that before, but you said it would be 5 minutes. Now it's been 5 years. And so we can't allow for people to be too critical and for too much time to go by, because then people will start to catch on to the lie. So the best way to keep them off their toes and to keep your track and your scent clean is to just keep lying. So it's important to just keep saying that Africans are weak. It's important to keep saying that Africans never fought back. It's important to keep saying that Africans were subservient, that they enjoyed slavery, that they were welcoming and walked right on board the slave ships. We're so happy to be shackled and chained. They were so happy to have a job. They were so happy to be in a space where they could get away from Africa, right? Like, all these rhetorical lies that exist in the ether, right? Like, this is what all this comes down to. And so I would say ideologically, they've been blinding us, and then socially, robbing us of our culture, robbing us of our language, robbing us of who we are as a people, shaming us for wanting to fight back and for wanting to protect our land, our resources, shaming us for admitting that we are African, shaming us for that, shaming us for admitting that our identity is African, and making us feel really small and really negative if we do not accept some other identity that has been force placed on us. And then, of course, physically robbing us. As we know, resources are being taken every single day. I just talked about the uranium. And so, as Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, mentioned, always he would say, a moral struggle against injustice is wonderful, but it is only an effective approach when the forces you are organizing against have a conscience. So the capitalist system does not have a conscience. It does not have a consciousness. It does not have the ability to be in a reflective state where one would consider how their consciousness would start to unravel. Because to have a consciousness means that you have some form, no matter how small or large, you have some form of humanity. You have some form of empathetic value. You have some way to understand that everything you're going through is not to only be considered because you are thinking about the fact that you still need to think about how your choices affect other people. Your consciousness is what reminds you, and probably what makes you feel guilty, if you know that you're not even acknowledging the shelterless person that's standing next to you at the stoplight. You may not have anything to give them, and you may not think that you need to give them something, but you can darn certain at least acknowledge them. You can smile at them, you can do a head nod, you can do a head up, you can do something to let them know that you see them as another individual standing there struggling, be it as it may, and you're still acknowledging their presence. That is so much better than ignoring them, because everyone in society already ignores them. And you are no different from the rest if you consider yourself to be doing that. Case in point, we're all one paycheck away from being in the same exact predicament. So how would you feel if someone ignored you when you were 2 payments behind on your car? And before you knew it, you were out on the street. But this is what consciousness will do for you. It will help you start to think about how the choices you make affect other people. It'll make you start reflecting on how you should actually consider treating other people fairly, and you should do your best to do that. Are you going to make mistakes? Are you going to have accidents? Are you going to mispronounce someone or call someone the wrong name or be insensitive for somebody who's differently abled? Of course, because that's what capitalism does, is it creates a society where we say offensive things all the time to people, usually because we live in a cis heteropatriarchal society. And if people don't fall into those specific categories, they're more likely to be excluded in the language we use, which is also colonized and driven by colonization. So sure, mistakes are going to happen, but you should at least admit those mistakes because of your consciousness. Your consciousness is there to remind you that you can still make a difference and still make a better choice that will change the outcome. But capitalism doesn't have any reflective process like that. They have no idea what that looks like. People who are proud to be capitalists are not interested in reflecting on anything, because that's probably taking them away from making money. And why would they care about how their choices affect other people? As long as their money is not impacted, so be it. And if their money is impacted, then we need to find a way to deal with the threat and neutralize that threat as soon as possible, so we can still figure out a way. And so the last thing I'll say is that, if this were true, based on what Kwame Ture said, is that, we should understand that the moral struggle against injustice is wonderful, but it's only effective if the forces that you are organizing against have a consciousness. And so we know that capitalism doesn't. So if this were true, then no matter how it would be, we should think about how being mistreated should not be based on a class status. It should never be based on class divide, but yet that's the reality and that's the world we live in. It's important for people to understand that we should not be assigning value to people based on how much money they make and how much money they can offer and contribute. But this is the reality, and our consciousness is constantly being straddled. It is constantly in conflict. It is constantly in discourse and turmoil, because we are not wired as people to truly treat other people the way capitalism is mandating that we treat people. That's why you probably, if you have any consciousness left, you probably feel a twinge of guilt when you don't acknowledge a shelterless person. Or if you see a child who is starving and having a hard time focusing in school, you should feel something when you see that. When I think about people who live in war zones like Palestine and other parts of the world, and my dad has said numerous times how the Afghanistan women or people who are able to lactate, how they have chemicals in their chest milk and in their breast milk. Like it makes me tear up when I think about that. It makes me tear up because I'm concerned about them. I'm concerned about their health. I'm concerned about them feeding their children. I'm concerned about them not being alive for the next time the child grows up. And these are normal things that people have come to live with. They have come to live with the fact that they have chemical metal shards in their body. They have come to live with the fact that they have chemicals in their body, so they cannot feed their children. They probably can't even be able to urinate a certain way. They probably have other biological and physical issues in their body because of the warfare, taking in the chemicals, breathing them in, respiratory problems, asthma, allergies. The list goes on and on and on. So the point I'm making is that is a system that does not have a consciousness, because if it did, it wouldn't have bombed those places in the first place, because it would have thought about the fact that people might be killed or harmed in the process of this. But that is not the world that we live in. And so Capitalism will never have a consciousness because it puts money over people. And the minute we start realizing that and decide that that is not good enough for us anymore, the better off we will all be. Next slide. All right. So we're going to talk about some dehumanizing efforts that have existed from the colonizers as ways to continue separating us out, giving this class divide and making it very large so that we can be very aware that certain people are to be treated in a certain way. And unfortunately, excuse me, those folks are severely disadvantaged compared to other folks who might have more power and therefore be advantaged in some way, shape, or form. I also think about it, how we're going to talk about passbook laws in just a moment. And I think about how that was really an initiative where the colonizer was treating us almost like a stack of papers, if you will. So if you work in an office setting and you've had to copy papers, then you understand the machine that you're using to copy these papers might offer to collate. If it's a large enough stack of papers that are being produced as a copy, it might offer to shift them and collate them as a way of organizing them. And I think about how that's probably how they felt like we needed to be treated, because we weren't being respected, we weren't being valued. And so the best way to treat something that you don't respect or value is to treat it like an object, not like a person that has the ability to breathe oxygen and should be treated with respect. But again, like, this is my consciousness coming out, right? Meanwhile, we're talking about people who couldn't care less. They could not care less about how badly they are treating folks, because it's not about the people, it's about the money. It's about the resources. It's about what's coming from Africa, uranium in this case. It's about how I can steal that resource and make as much money as possible for the rest of my life. And I don't care if it means that I have to kill people in the process. I don't care if it means that I have to lose a part of myself. I don't care if it means that even my children might have to die because of it, as long as I can keep making money. Like, these are the people that we're talking about, you all. So let's talk about these passbook laws. We can think of examples such as the passbook laws in Azania, or what the colonized term today would be considered South Africa. So we had passbook laws that were created by the British, they were created by Germans, they were created by the Dutch, and this was all as a mechanism to control us based on race. That was just in Azania that these passbook laws were created by the British, the Germans, and the Dutch. If we move forward and we think about the pass laws in Rwanda, they were created by Belgium and the French to control us, as you guessed it, based on race. We can also think of the pass laws in the Congo that were also created by Belgium to control us based on race. We think about segregation as an example in the US as a way to control us by race. And we can also think about similar policies throughout Central America, the Caribbean, South America, and other parts of Africa and Europe. As I prepare to close, I hope that you all heard the common denominator as a way to divide out based on class and based on race. And so, we think a lot of times about race and how, white supremacy has a system that impacts people of color. And I think that it's very important to think about race. It's very important to think about racism. It's very important to have these conversations. But I always try to bring up with my students, race is not the only problem that we're dealing with. Racism is not the only problem that we're dealing with. Classism is one of the most evilest systems of all, because that system promotes and consents to people deciding how much value they want to give you based on how they perceive you deserve to be treated. I mean, what kind of crazy stuff is that? I'm only going to treat you a certain way based on how much respect I think you deserve, because I really need to know how much money you have. I really need to know how much income you have. Do you have a lot of money? Do you come from a lot of money? Oh, you're not wealthy. Okay, so that changes how I treat you. And, we could talk all day long about all the contradictions that come with this. But the bottom line is, the messed up system that we live in continues to practice this on a day-to-day basis. For those of us who have access to have insurance, for example, whether we have public or private, right? So if we have public insurance, then we have insurance that's provided through the government, but there are known statistical facts, articles, scientific journals that have published on this for decades, that people who have public insurance versus those who have private are more likely to be treated badly. Now, are we advocating that you should have private insurance under a capitalist system? Absolutely not, because no one matters. Everybody is soon going to be terminated because it's all about how much money you're paying, not about the fact that you deserve respect. So I am in no way advocating that if you have public, you should switch to private. The point I'm simply making is that there are statistical articles that have supported that people literally are treated more badly because they have public insurance. And the argument I'm making is you can look at any show, especially an old school show that was still understanding how Medicaid versus private insurance like Blue Cross Blue Shield or Kaiser or Humana, how those came about. And I think specifically about an older episode of Golden Girls and how Sophia was in the hospital and they had misplaced her as a patient. So she was in the elevator and there were some insurance gougers that were coming in and they were talking about a new settlement that they were going to get. And they realized that she had been misplaced. They saw her hospital bracelet and they asked her what her name was. She told them. And then they said, what kind of insurance do you have? Not what are you checked in for, or where's the doctor, or how long have you been in the elevator, but what kind of insurance do you have? And she made a joke and she said, I'm on Medicare. And then they stepped back from her like she had COVID-19 in 1985 when the episode was taped. So the point I'm making to you all, as funny as that was, is this happens every day. Because this is a reality in terms of the class divide. And this is a reality in terms of how people decide, again, how they perceive how they should treat you based on the values they're giving you because of your access to money. This is what class division will do for us. And if you believe that that is a horrible system, then I strongly suggest you join an organization that is working for justice, because the chances are your organization is going to work hard to terminate class divide. I know that's what we're working on, and we can work with you to do that, because that does not work for any of us. It's a horrible system. And so we, again, ask for your donations so that our comrades in Burkina Faso can raise money to get these books for our children so that they too can learn about why class division needs to be terminated and eradicated as soon as possible. Ashe.
Ashe, thank you very much. And I am just going to continue on with what you have started for us. I do want to say there's one correction I need to make, and it's entirely my fault in the first slide with that brutal thug, King Leopold from Belgium. So one thing that we have to start this next section on is understanding that the Congo in Central Africa is the most mineral-rich country on the entire planet Earth. And the Kinshasa region, back in those days, in the 60s, it was known as the Katanga region, but today it's known as Kinshasa. That's the most mineral-rich region of the Congo. So we're talking about a very high-profile area in the world that has, for decades, been a center of attention for people who are vying for resources in the world. And by resources, we mean the natural resources that power the world. So today, the Congo is most known for its ability to produce columbite tantalite, which is coltan, which is used to, it's a mineral ore that you grind it down into a powder. It can hold a digital charge. So any device that gives or receives a signal, your cell phone, your laptop, your flat screen TV, whatever, doesn't work without coltan. So the Congo is, really well known for that, because most of the world's reserves on columbite tantalite are there. But back 100 years ago, when that thug King Leopold was in power, it wasn't uranium yet. It was actually the ivory, which we'll talk about in a second. And the uranium came later, which we'll talk about. But in terms of the Congo itself, it's just important to understand, like I said, that, it is the most mineral-rich region in the world. And Belgium colonized the Congo and then used the Berlin Conference in 1884 to consolidate its control over the territory. So in other words, Belgium was in the Congo hundreds of years ago. And if you don't know the history, the Berlin Conference, it was not the beginning of colonialism. A lot of people have that part confused. What the Berlin Conference was in 1884, these Europeans were stepping all over each other, trying to gain control of as much territory as they could in Africa, just like they were doing over here and how they've done all over the world. And so what these criminals did is they had the Berlin Conference to try to establish some boundaries as to what European would control what part of Africa. And so from the Berlin Conference, Belgium was awarded the Congo region. And it's important to note that the Congo itself is over 3 times the size of Belgium. And we already said it's the most mineral rich region in the world. So Belgium fought viciously to make sure they could consolidate their control over the Congo, because they used, in King Leopold and all the criminals since him up through, current day, really used the resources from the Congo, or the Belgian Congo as they used to call it, to really finance Belgium. The entire country, its entire economy was based on stealing resources from the Congo. And to do that, to ensure that that system stayed in place, King Leopold ushered in this brutal and violent system of control over the Congolese people, or the people in the Congo. And as Shakur said, over 10 million people were murdered in about an 11-year period, about 100 years ago in the Congo. But twice that many people, an estimated 20 to 25 million people, were controlled through this brutal practice the Belgians had of cutting off the limbs of the African people there. And you see in the picture 3 people who have had their limbs cut off. So they had 20 to 25 million people who, if you were out after a certain hour, they would just cut off one of your limbs. If they thought you were suspicious for any reason, without any evidence, they would just cut off one of your limbs. It was a common practice in the country, and the purpose behind it was to terrorize the people in the Congo. And to do this practice went on for decades, this practice of amputations and murder in the Congo. And the reason why we're telling you this is because these people today, they'll tell you, well, we don't need to talk about history. It makes white kids feel bad to hear this talk about. We don't give a goddamn what white kids feel. We're talking about the truth of what happens to our people, because this kind of damn stuff that these people did to us set in motion the mechanisms that explains everything that's happening to us today. So if you don't know the history, there's no way you can understand what's happening today. And that's why we have so many damn clowns on social. I saw a clown today. He's always on there. He's on TikTok, and he talked about the Congo. And the only reason why I didn't engage him, because I already had a interaction with this fool, and he confirmed that he's an absolute idiot. So, I don't have any desire to engage him anymore. But he's talking about how some of the problems in the Congo today, and there's no white people involved in it. So to him, that's some sort of contradiction. But that's because this clown has, worms swimming between his ears and doesn't have the ability to comprehend this type of history that we're talking about. The Congo is a prime example of the problems in Africa today. There's been absolute disintegration of any structure there for decades. Ever since the National Congolese movement came to power in 1960, the country has been stabilized. That's going on 70 years ago. So there's no way you can understand anything about what's happening in the Congo today if you don't understand this history of what happened 100 years ago in the Congo and what's always happened there. So that's why we talk about it. And so we want to talk about the National Congolese movement and Pan-Africanism, because we have a picture here of Kwame Nkrumah on the left and Patrice Lumumba, Patrice Emery Lumumba, who was the young man who wanted to bring freedom to the people of the Congo. And Lumumba attended the All African People's Conference in Ghana in December of 1958. Kwame Nkrumah had just led the Convention People's Party to independence in Ghana. Ghana was the first country to get independence from European colonizers in 1957, the year before that. And Nkrumah was interested and understood clearly. He said it in his emancipation speech the day of independence in Ghana, March 6, 1957. He said it then, and he never wavered from the position. And when he said that the independence of Ghana is meaningless without the total liberation of Africa, he understood that clearly at that time, almost 70 years ago. So he organized the All-African People's Conference in Ghana the next year. And Patrice Lumumba, as a very young man in his 20s, came to that conference. A lot of people came to that conference. And Lumumba was so inspired by people like Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré that he began to become mentored by Kwame Nkrumah after the All-African People's Conference. And it was very important because before that conference, there were other so-called liberation movements from the Congo. One of them that was connected to this man, Holden Roberto, who ended up being the leader of the national movement to liberate Angola, which was a CIA front group in Angola. But they were based in the Congo, which is right next to Angola. So these people were seen as liberation movements at the time. But when Lumumba emerged with the national Congolese movement, that changed all that. Now we had a legitimate and genuine liberation movement in the Congo that was interested in bringing true independence to the Congo. And the All-African People's Conference in Ghana in 1958, in December of 58, radicalized Lumumba. And he went back to the Congo and wanted to see the independence of Congo as connected to the struggle to unite all of Africa, understanding that these European colonizers are there to steal and control African resources. And the only route to true African independence is African people controlling the resources that we produce. So Lumumba left Ghana extremely inspired to build the national Congolese movement and their efforts to bring independence to the Congo. And becoming worried about Lumumba's political independence because he was not a stooge for Western imperialism, and Lumumba's relationship to radical leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré. Imperialism in 1958, during the independence drive towards independence in the Congo, began to plot its strategy to get rid of Patrice Lumumba and the national Congolese movement, as well as Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré and all of the other, Modibo Keita and all of the other revolutionary leaders in Africa. But the Central Intelligence Agency, that's what we call them criminals in action, the CIA, they began to initiate a plan to eliminate Lumumba because Lumumba was talking about independence in the Congo and that all of these resources in the Congo needed to be utilized to uplift the Congo and Africa. And these capitalists and these colonizers knew, well, this could never be because we're reliant on these resources. At that time, in 1960, you had the Cold War happening, which was the war between the capitalist world and the so-called socialist world at that time, led by the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, or the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. You had the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and you had the Warsaw Pact, and you had this thing called the Cold War. And the fight these people were engaging in to control the world was who would have the biggest atomic weapons, the biggest nuclear weapons. This is when the nuclear weapons drive was in full force. And in 1957, the Soviet Union displayed its nuclear power, not only by launching Sputnik into space, but also demonstrated that they had atomic power. So the US and all of these capitalist countries were really pushing to improve their atomic power. And guess what? Uranium is what produces atomic power. And 80% of the world's reserves for uranium are where? In the Congo. So the Congo was at the center of this damn Cold War. And Lumumba and the national Congolese movement talking about, no, we want to use uranium and all of the Congolese resources to uplift African people. These Western imperialists, they could hear none of that. And they knew then that he had to go. And when the Congo had its independence ceremony and Patrice Lumumba was elected prime minister of the Congo in 1960, in July June of 1960, and they had the Congolese celebration in the town. They called it Leopoldville then. That's what it was called. And the then King of Belgium, King Valdemar, or whatever the hell that cracker's name was, he came there to speak, and he talked about the virtues of King Leopold, this murderous scum that was in the Congo. And at that time, Patrice Lumumba wasn't even scheduled to speak at the celebration, but he jumped up to the microphone, the courageous young African that he was, and denounced all of those crackers and told them they need to get the hell out of the Congo, and the Congolese people and African people would direct the direction of independence for the Congo. This was such a proud moment for our people, but it also sealed Lumumba's death certificate with these imperialists. They knew then that he would have to go. And, you know, like I said, uranium for nuclear power during the Cold War in the late 50s, that was the thing. Now, in the bottom picture, Joseph Desiree Mobutu, as he was known then, he later changed his name to Mobutu Sese Seko. He was a military man. But at that time, it's important to understand, you know, there's a saying, keep your enemies close, keep your friends closer. And, you know, I've always struggled with that saying because it just sounds so disingenuous to me. But when you look at history, you know, it makes it very difficult to argue against some of the logic in that statement, because Mobutu was, and most people don't know this, he was an officer. He was a minister within Lumumba's National Congolese movement. He was a trusted, I would say, friend to Lumumba. At least Lumumba thought he was a friend, but he wasn't a friend. He was a scoundrel. He was working with the CIA. Even during those days, they recruited Mobutu to work with them, and British intelligence recruited him. And what he was doing was compiling information on Lumumba and the National Congolese movement so that he could undermine the MNC. And so let's talk about, because we know the history. What happened is that Patrice Lumumba, Maurice Impolo, and Joseph Okoto, high-ranking officials in the National Congolese movement, were rounded up and were assassinated. Their bodies were sunken into acid to eliminate any evidence. And the Congo spiraled out of control and is still out of control to this day. And this happened in 1961. So that's to that coon that had the video on TikTok talking about the white people aren't even there. What a dumbass, right? Like, do y'all know that when this happened, what I just described in the Congo in 1960, do you know when the next election took place in the entire country after 1961? They did not have another election until 2007. And during all those years, all of the institutions in the Congo were in a state of disarray. Schools did not function regularly. There were no regular public services. There was nothing except imperialism stealing all of the resources, and the Congolese people suffering in a way that is just really brings tears to your eyes if you have any amount of humanity inside of you. And so that's why I get upset when I see black coons on social media raising their goddamn mouths talking about something they don't know nothing about because some cracker paid them some money to say it. I mean, someday we will be able to take these people and give them what they rightfully deserve. But for now, we're going to talk about Pan-Africanism responded back then in 1960 to what was happening in the Congo. Responded very well, actually. Kwame Nkrumah's frantic efforts to try and guide Lumumba through the crisis and the succession of Kinshasa. I told you Kinshasa was formerly Katanga, and that's the most mineral-rich region in the Congo. And Moshe Tushambe, working with the CIA and other reactionary forces, Belgium intelligence, they wanted to take the Katanga region then, Kinshasa, and succeed and take the most mineral-rich region in the country and succeed with it, make it not a part of the Congo anymore in an effort to undermine Lumumba's government. And so Nkrumah was working, and then at the time, Joseph Kasavubu, who was the president, because they had a coalition government, because when they had elections in 1960, no one got an overwhelming majority of the votes because there were ethnic tensions in the country and it just didn't happen that way. But the MNC and Lumumba got the majority, got more votes than anybody else. So Lumumba became the prime minister and Joseph Kasavubu became the president. And Kasavubu dismissed Lumumba from his position as prime minister under the urgings of imperialism to do that. And Nkrumah was trying to guide Lumumba through this difficult time. And one of the things that happened is that the United Nations, then very young, only 15 years old, had peacekeeping troops that were there. Now, we didn't know about the United Nations then what we know now. But at that time, the thought was that that would be a good thing. It would be an objective force that would bring balance to the world. So Nkrumah talked Sekou Touré in Ghana, Modibo Keita in Mali, to, along with the Ghanaian troops, to send their troops to the Congo to serve under the UN peacekeeping force. And so the Ghanaian and Guinean troops were assigned to the contingent, as well as the Malian troops. And what happened there is, unfortunately, because what Nkrumah and Sekou Touré at that time did not know is that the UN was being forced, and all types of efforts were being manipulated by the CIA to control that. So unfortunately, it was actually the Ghanaian troops who prevented Patrice Lumumba from being able to broadcast message to the Congolese people about what was going on when he was basically being held under house arrest. But it also needs to be said that Patrice Lumumba would not have lived as long as he did were it not for the troops from Ghana and Guinea, Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré's troops, because once they began to realize the troops were heroes from Ghana and Guinea, once they began to realize what was happening, they decided to act on their own. And when have you ever heard of military people acting on their own? But they decided to do that. And they began to see their role as protecting the legitimate government of Patrice Lumumba and the National Congolese Movement. And they had what they called the ANC, which was the Congolese military, which was controlled by that traitor Mobutu. They tried many times to kidnap Lumumba so that they could assassinate him before they eventually did. But the Ghanaian and the Guinean troops prevented that from happening multiple times. Most people don't know that history. And at that time, Nkrumah and Touré and Keita were talking about taking their troops out of the UN and creating an all-African military command that would ensure that Lumumba's government was placed into power. But unfortunately, at that time, again, Nkrumah really wanted to have faith that the UN officers, especially the person assigned to the Congo, a man by the name of Dayal, who was from India, was really working in a principled way to try to do what was right. So Nkrumah felt like the best approach was to try and follow that line of logic. Now, unfortunately, what happened is Patrice Lumumba, getting tired of being in the house under house arrest and feeling like he wanted to get out and address the people, slipped out of the house. And that was his undoing. He and a number of Congolese officials, Maurice Impolo, Joseph Okoto, they slipped out of the house where they were being held. Had they stayed there, the Ghanaian and Guinean troops probably would have been able to continue to keep them alive and protect them. But unbeknownst to the Ghanaian forces and the Guinean forces, the Lumumba troops slipped out. And they were eventually captured by these Congolese military forces led by Mobutu. And ironically, the clown that ended up capturing Lumumba, a man by the name of Joseph Ankra from Ghana, who was one of the Negro commanders, and I say that for a reason that I'll explain in a second, of the Ghanaian forces in the Congo, captured Lumumba. This is also the same coon that in 1966 helped lead the CIA-backed military coup d'etat in Ghana that overthrew the legitimately elected government of Kwame Nkrumah. So you see, these crooks and coons were working all the time with the CIA to undermine legitimate revolutionary progressive efforts that were designed to uplift the masses of people in Ghana. And one of the problems that's never been discussed is that when these European countries left Africa after African countries became independent, you have to realize that it was the Europeans that had all of the knowledge, all of the military training, all of the understanding of how to use the weapons, all of the technical training, all of the understanding of how to use all of the technical equipment. They had that. And the few Africans that they trained were trained to carry out those duties in the interests of the colonizing forces, not in the interests of African liberation. Just like you Negroes that go to college here in this country are trained to go out and represent the capitalist system. And most of you do exactly that. So we can't act like we can't understand, how they do us. That's what they do. They're not training us to seek our liberation from them. They're training us to represent their interests and carry on their system of power. So that's what happened. In fact, when the Congo became independent in 1960, there were only an estimated 15 college-educated, so-called professional people in the whole goddamn country. So they were reliant, and this is not even just the case in Congo, but all over Africa, even still to this day, they were reliant on these European colonizers. And the picture, the cracker on the screen, is General Alexander, who was the commander-in-chief of the Ghanaian forces in the Congo. This white man was working day to day with Larry Devlin, should have been Larry Devil, the devil who was the CIA's lead man in the Congo, who was responsible for many plots to take Patrice Lumumba's life, and later Kwame Nkrumah and Secretary and everybody else's life. But this cracker on the screen was the general commander of the troops in the Congo. So this explains why so much was done that was so underhanded and undermining. And at the time, Nkrumah was not aware, was intentionally made unaware of what this cracker was doing in the Congo. And once Nkrumah became aware, he removed this guy from his position. But by then, you had these other people like Ankara who were also working with the CIA, also working in the interest of imperialism. So this is important because I've seen over the years these people blame Kwame Nkrumah for what happened in the Congo, and that's not a class analysis. A class analysis is that we did not have capacity at that time to do any better than what we did. Every effort was made. Every effort was made. I told you, and it's a fact. It's irrefutable. Lumumba wouldn't have lived as long as he would have been killed months before he actually was, were it not for Nkrumah and Secretary's troops. That's an undeniable fact. So I don't want to hear anybody talking about Kwame Nkrumah and Secretary. Those are our fathers in Pan-Africanism. We know what the hell they did. You don't know. You didn't even know who they were before we told you what their names were. So we don't want to hear that nonsense. And this is the reason why Nkrumah wrote the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. He didn't call in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare for Organization of African Unity or African Union. He called for All African Committee for Political Coordination, a mass African revolutionary formation on the ground all throughout the African continent. He didn't call for African troops to join the United Nations as they did in 1960 in the Congo. He called for an all-African high command and all-African People's Revolutionary Army. And guess what? That is exactly what we're building today. All of that is happening. But we also have to talk quickly about some of the errors by Patrice Lumumba, because as I mentioned, Lumumba's error was being impatient. He was only 35 years old. It's understandable. Being impatient. He didn't listen to all of the good advice. Even the CIA acknowledged that, because they had their moles, they knew what was going on. They acknowledged that a lot of the advice Nkrumah gave Lumumba was good. Lumumba didn't follow all of it. And his decision to leave that house was his undoing. So that has to be acknowledged. And some of the lessons that we've learned today as it relates to African resources, African unity, Russia, China, and the traditional European and US colonizers. Look, it's very straightforward, you all. No solution for Africa and African people is going to come from anybody else except the 2.5 billion African masses scattered and suffering all throughout the African continent, in Europe, and all throughout the Western Hemisphere. We are the ones who will propose the solution. We say the people are going to choose Pan-Africanism. That's the logical solution, where we take control of our Mother Africa, and all of her precious resources, and that we organize and utilize those resources to advance Africa and to contribute towards African humanity and all of humanity. That's the solution to the problem that we have there. We take these degrees that we're developing here and we use them for African liberation, because I just explained we don't have those degrees at home in Africa. And that's what Marcus Garvey was trying to do over 100 years ago. But this is what we have to do to stop these types of things from happening. Stop what happened in the Congo. Stop what happened in Ghana. Stop what happened in Mali. Stop what happened in Guinea. Stop what happened in Libya in 2011. This is how we do that. We're not trying. Stop saying we don't have any leaders. We don't need any individual leaders. We need mass cadre who are committed to the African Revolution. They cannot kill all of us. That's what we're building in the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We don't have a single leader. Kwame Ture's been dead 25 years, and we're still going, I would argue, in better position today, despite our weaknesses, to forward our quest for Pan-Africanism. And he deserves a ton of credit, along with all the other Mawin and Coyote, David Brothers, all of the other cadre in the APRP, my big brother Sekou, all of the initial cadre in the APRP deserve great credit. We're trying to carry the mission that they gave us. And I'm trying to pass it on to people like Shakur so they can carry it on. And we're going to be free by doing that. There is absolutely no question that we are going to be victorious. And the only people who disagree with that are those of you who are going to take the road of the Mobutus and the Ankras and side with our enemies against us. And once we get organized, we will effectively deal with you. Make no mistake about it. So we want to thank you for joining us. And we want to say we'll be back next week, of course, same time, same place. Our topic next week is the utter failure of the African Black church. And we just didn't have room. We could have put mosque, synagogue, we could have put anything. They've all failed us. And we want to talk about the difference between faith and these religious institutions. Because in the APRP, we say, don't let religion interfere with your spirituality. Think about that for a moment. So that's what we're going to talk about next week. Go to the APRP Forward Ever shop and buy something, you all, and tell people about it. Go to aprp-intl.org. Join the All African People's Revolutionary Party. abetterworld.me. You can get all of these videos after the fact. You can share them with people who didn't see them. Hood Communists, support that wonderful revolutionary blog. Again, support the Thomas Sankara Center for Liberation and Pan-African Unity. The QR code is there. The URL is there. Pledge an amount every month and stick to it. Support independent revolutionary African organization on the ground in Africa. That's what the AAPRP is doing. We have a number of broadcasts there. We invite you to support them. And if you're here in Northern California, or even if you're not, because we're live streaming it, we're having a program. There's a flyer on the screen there. October 5th from 7 to 9 in Oakland, California at the East Arts Alliance Center at 2277 International Boulevard. I still call it East 14th for those of you from the Yay area. That's what we call it. But no war with Africa. The fight for Pan-Africanism and liberation in Africa. We're going to have a panel discussion. We're going to show the presentation of our young organizer, Nim Richardson from Burkina Faso. She was here last week. And then we're going to have a panel discussion that's going to include myself for the APRP, Tony Gonzalez from the American Indian Movement, Pierre Lebrassier from the Haiti Action Committee, and hopefully representatives from the Arab Resource Organizing Center and others. And finally, we want to ask you to continue to support my book, A Guide for Organizing Defense Against White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence. fascists do not have a right to exist, and we're going to do everything we can to stop them from having a presence in any society where we exist. Forward ever, you all. Backwards never. Thank you for joining us today. Tell some people, come back. We are winning. Don't let these people fool you. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening.